Shalom and welcome to Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson. The title for this lesson today is Lessons from the Wilderness. Now, today we're going to be looking at part of the lessons from the wilderness, but not all because there's so many. The part we're not going to include today are the images relating to shepherding because that is really plentiful in the Bible. So then the next two sessions after today are going to be about shepherding. So we're actually going to stay with the wilderness for 3 full weeks. Just to mention again, I do have this book available free of charge if any of you are interested. Letters from Michael. It's a detailed of life during that first century time period when Jesus walked the earth. And mentioned to you before some of the titles of the different chapters of the letters. But it's kind of a topical study, and every single subject or chapter relates to Jesus and his particular teachings on that topic. And included, too, is a very large appendix that has things like this. Pictures of the temple as a perfect picture of Jesus, going into detail of that type of a topic. So if you're interested, you can email me at this email right here, and I would be happy to send you one free of charge. Now, just kind of looking ahead, what's coming up next, and I should mention what is coming up for the very next session. There's going to be about a 1-month delay because my wife Sherry and I are going to be going to the country of Turkey with a group, so we'll be gone for a while. But the next two are going to be about shepherding, as I mentioned. The next sessions is going to be shepherding in general. We're going to look at lots of images in the Bible. And then after that, we're going to focus on Psalm 23, real specifically. That very famous Psalm of David. Other topics, we'll be looking at the Lord's Prayer, the Hebraic origins of all of these things, of course, the idea of the kingdom of heaven, lots of kingdom parables, of course, the Good Samaritan. We're going to see if we can learn some new insights into the background of the story. Ancient Hatred is going to be looking at the story of anti-Semitism through all of history. The Holocaust did not happen in a vacuum. There was a lot that went before it. Appointed times means we're going to be looking at the festivals of ancient Israel. Two means we'll be spending at least a couple sessions on that because there are 7 festivals altogether. David and Goliath, the incredible discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes who likely wrote them. The fishing on the Sea of Galilee is very fascinating to me. We're going to spend a couple weeks on that because I've done a lot of research into the background of these stories. Grain and harvest. Healing in his wings, that's the story of the woman subject to bleeding, whom Jesus healed. The story of Legion, the demoniac. We're going to look at marriage as a symbol throughout the scriptures. It's just a very, very rich picture. The olive trees and all of its representations. We're going to spend a week on the tabernacle, another week on the temple, vineyards and grapes, and Zacchaeus. Now, these are just a few of the upcoming topics, but just to kind of give you an idea of what I kind of have in mind here. Now, it's interesting, if you look at the land of Israel, half of it, 50% of it, is desert. The word midbar in Hebrew can be translated as desert or also wilderness. I'm going to more often use the term wilderness. So the question is, how could that be the promised land when half of it is desert or wilderness? That doesn't make any sense. So, and there are several deserts in Israel, the whole southern part of it pretty much, plus a lot of the central area. The one we're going to focus the most on is the Judean desert because that's where most of the biblical images are from. But there is also the Negev, the Zin, and the Paran deserts. This is the Negev. The Negev surrounds a city called Beersheba, where the patriarchs all live, very important place. It's a very large desert. The Zin, way in the south, the Israelites wandered in these areas for 40 years. This will be that part of Israel. This is what the Zin looks like. You can imagine wandering through that area. And the Paran Desert, quick look at that. This is down near the Sinai border. In fact, that's a picture right at the border of that desert. So I mentioned the Judean be the one we're going to mostly focus on here. The Judean wilderness, which is right about here. It's not a real big area. It looks like this. I showed you this picture before, but way back. But this is Bethlehem in the foreground. And you're looking to the east towards the Dead Sea in that hazy valley. But you can see how quickly the land changes from Bethlehem into the wilderness, how suddenly it becomes very, very dry. Another picture going deeper into the wilderness, the Judean wilderness. And here's another picture of just camels that you would find in this area all over the place because it's a very popular area for grazing of camels and obviously shepherding. Now, this is a video I've shown you before, but I think it's very fascinating, so I'd like to show you it again, of the Judean wilderness.
This harsh area is a portion of the Judean wilderness, the traditional location of Jesus' temptations. Geographically, the wilderness is a rectangular strip of land, about 60 miles long and 10 miles wide, that extends between the Judean hills near Jerusalem on the west to the Jordan River Valley, Jericho and the Dead Sea on the east. Although appearing desolate, it is not uninhabited, as can be seen from the occasional shepherds and their flocks. At about 2,700 feet above sea level, the land descends almost 4,000 feet in a series of narrow gorges and steep chalky cliffs to the valley floor, where, at the Dead Sea, it is 1,300 feet below sea level. The helicopter is now flying east, and in the distance is the Jordan Valley, and barely discernible in the midst of the distance is the north end of the Dead Sea, with the mountains of Moab on the horizon.
Now, as you notice there, we flew over the top of a shepherd with his sheep and goats. By the way, those videos, I mentioned this before too, but are from an organization called Preserving Bible Times. There, I purchased those videos from them, and they're used with permission. So this is looking from Mount Nebo. So now we're going to go back and kind of join Moses and the Israelites just before they entered the Promised Land. Of course, Moses did not, but the Israelites did. So here we are, up on top of Mount Nebo, looking down, Dead Sea on the left, Israel in the beyond us here. So why did God choose here? So let's go to this passage here, where the text tells us, the land you are entering to take over is not like the land of Egypt. This is Moses talking. From which you have come, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot, as in a vegetable garden. Now, they settled in a land called Goshen, the Bible tells us. That reference from Genesis tells us. You can see in that area. It's a very fertile part of the Nile River Valley. It's actually called a delta. And how it's different than Israel, that area, is quite significant because in this area, there's actually a lot more water equivalent over the course of the year because of the flooding. So it was much, much greater. And that's a reason in times of famine, the Israelites and other groups came down to Egypt to get food. When no one else had it, they did because the Nile always flooded. They were not dependent on God here. Men created these channels away from this flooded land to create an area of irrigation. This is hand watered in a sense compared to the rain from heaven. Okay, now back to what Moses is saying. But the land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. Now, the word heaven in Hebrew is shamayim. Shah is from, maim is water, where the water comes from. So literally that's what heaven means in the Hebrew language. That means literally the provider of rain, how God provides rain. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands, the Lord will open the heavens, the storehouses of his bounty, to send rain on your land in season and to bless all the work of your hands. So we can see now why God is choosing this particular land. He has very specific reasons of obedience of his people. Now, this little diagram gives us an idea of the rainfall in Israel. In the far north, there's much more. And the rain, by the way, is only from about December to very early March. That's it. It doesn't rain at all the rest of the year, not any at all. So it's just a very brief time period. And in that far north around the Galilee is the wettest area, the most fertile. And if you remember that the last lesson we did about Caesarea Philippi in the city of Dan, you can see how lush it is up there. 20 to 25, the Central Highlands, 15 to 20. It goes down lower as you go further south, and then down in that Judean wilderness, 0 to 2. There are places down there where it hasn't rained in many, many, many years, not even one drop. So there's much more rain in the north than in the south, where there's a whole lot less. Now let's see if we can draw a lesson from this. So that would mean that the north was far more prosperous because they had all this water, and back in those days, it's an agricultural society. So farming is obviously central. You have to produce a lot of crops. So the northern part, when Israel divided into these two kingdoms, become known as Israel, and the southern part was known as Judah. If we look at this in terms of prosperity, the north was richer land, more rain, more fertile, and the south was much more difficult. They had to be much more dependent on God. If we look at the number of righteous kings in each, it kind of tells a story. In the north, none. The sections called Israel at that time, they had 0 righteous kings, and in the south had 8. So that's quite a difference. It's kind of a lesson there, I think, that for each of us, and even like in the United States, we're a prosperous country. As we've gotten more prosperous, probably more and more people have turned away from God, thinking I can do this on my own. Do I need God because I have prosperity on my own? So there certainly are lessons here, and this is kind of central to this whole idea of choosing this country, why God chose Israel. Now, in terms of rainfall, I mentioned to you that seasonal rain of about 3.5 months, sometimes only 3 months. There's also this one too, though, mentioned in Joel and Hosea. He has poured down for you the rain, the early and latter rain. Now, these are special blessings rains, where sometimes they can get early rain, maybe even in October, really early November, or as late as April. And I've been there already when that's happened. And in the scriptures, that's a special blessing. Now, it might be this is representative of the two comings of the Messiah. There's different interpretations on this. I think very possibly this could be possible. So let's go to the Sea of Galilee for a second. I want to show you something here that's interesting. Here's what it looks like. It's shaped like a harp. And in Israel, it's not called the Sea of Galilee. It's called Lake Kinneret, which means harp. And you can kind of see the resemblance there. The reason it's called sea, kind of mistakenly, is the Hebrews and later the Jews, to be called Jews, were really not sea people. They were land people. So in Hebrew, they only had one word for water, and it was yam. Yam meant lake, sea, or ocean. So it could mean all those things. Sea of Galilee is not a sea. It's a freshwater lake, just to kind of explain that. But let's look to the north, that little section I have outlined. We're going to look at it in the spring and then again in the fall to see how different it looks. Now, here's in the spring. This would be after the winter rains. You can see it's pretty lush. It's green. Let's go to the fall. And this would be after this is late fall and a very, very dry summer, not a drop of rain. Same area. Look at it. Isn't that a stark comparison there? I wanted to show you that to see how very different the country looks. I've been here in both seasons and it looks so very different. So how in the world could Israel survive during 8 or 9 months when it doesn't rain a drop? How's that possible? Well, one particular event is how they can survive. It's really simple. It's called dew. Now, in Hosea, God said, I will be as the dew to Israel. Now you think about what is dew? It's simply the water droplets forming on plants or rocks during the evening. Well, Israel, the way God designed this country, has an incredible amount of dew. In fact, 250 nights a year they have dew, and it's really, really heavy often, equal to 6 to 11 inches of rain a year. So that's how Israel survives during that dry season, before modern day irrigation, of course. Is they survive by this idea. They live in a land with a huge amount of dew. So much, the trees literally got soaked. And today even, now obviously didn't have cars back then, but today they actually have to use squeegees to clear their car windows in the morning. There's so much water on them during this season of the year. So, looking at this verse again, I will be as a dew to Israel. So because of this, the fruit could grow and ripen during the dry summer seasons, along with the other crops. So God is like dew. Think about that. What is dew like? Is it something that's very, very bold and out there and makes noise and it's clear it's here? Or is it something that's extremely quiet? You have to look closely to notice it, and yet it's life-giving. So I think we can draw lessons from that is during those times in our life where maybe we're not really understanding where God is or he doesn't seem to be here. He's like dew. He's still sustaining us. Even though we may not see it, just like the dew forming, he's going to sustain us during these difficult times. So, in difficult times, does God always give us the details, what we'd like to know? In other words, God, what's going to happen next? Let's look at some examples from the scriptures. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And then here's what God said. He didn't give him this big old grand design. Here's the whole deal. You're going to go to the, river. We're going to part the seas. He didn't tell him any of that. He just said, "I will be with you." That's it. Don't worry about it. I will be with you. When Joshua, about to cross the Jordan River, when that happened, "Today I will begin to make you a great leader in the eyes of all the Israelites. They will know that I am with you just as I was with Moses." Now, isn't that interesting? Again, he didn't tell Joshua all the details about Jericho and everything else that's going to happen. He just said, "I am with you." I think there's a real lesson from that. Now, so many things happened in the wilderness in Israel in their history and biblical understanding. This verse from Deuteronomy, "And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness to humble thee and to prove thee, to know that was what it was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or not." This is from Deuteronomy. In other words, he was going to test the Israelites to see that they would honor him, they would follow him during all these years in the wilderness. Moses in the wilderness, this happened. "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name?" Because that's something in the ancient world they always want a name. No, what is the name? What name is very significant. "Then what shall I tell them?" Well, that's where Moses met this burning bush, or saw this burning bush. And that's where this encounter took place. And where God told him, said, "I was, I am, and I will be." He said, "I am that I am." And that word in Hebrew, that name in Hebrew is Yahweh, which is later translated as Lord. During the intertestamental period, become more known as Adonai. So what God is telling Moses here, by his very name, Yahweh, "I am that I am," or "I was, I am, and I will be." Watch me by what I've done, what I'm doing now. You can trust me for what is to come by his very name. In the wilderness, the 10 Commandments were given to his people. And we're going to learn, especially on the one on marriage, that literally represents a marriage covenant, a betrothal covenant, these 10 Commandments. In the wilderness, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough just for that day, just for a day at a time." Well, in the wilderness, he dwelt with them in his tabernacle. I mentioned before, 18 chapters about the details of this, and we will study it because it's so important. It's a picture of Jesus with only 2 on creation. Well, in the wilderness, so many things like this, and I have mentioned this before, but these pathways and this straight path, the path of righteousness, which we'll learn much more about as we get into shepherding, even beyond what we've learned already, to live holy lives, so that this would bring the Messiah. They believed that if they lived holy lives, especially the Essenes, the Messiah would come. So John the Baptist was in the wilderness. He said, "A voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him." He's referring to this whole idea. So did Messiah Jesus show up in the wilderness? Well, yeah, we know he did. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Now, it's interesting, the word for wilderness or desert, midbar, literally means circle or order. In other words, there's this sense of calmness, this orderliness in the wilderness or in the desert. And that's interesting. And if we compare it to the word for city, it's Ir, this means chaos. So in Hebrew, the idea of the wilderness is the area of contentment, of quietness, of order, and the city is a place of chaos. I just think that's kind of fascinating. So let's look at a few lessons from desert trees. Okay? Now, there are many references to God as Zel. T is silent. Zel is shade. Great temperature differences between the shade and the sun. Now, because the air is so dry, if you've been in a desert area, you know there's a great difference between the heat of the day and the cool of the night, because the humidity allows that temperature to vary a ton. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day. Now, this is called a broom bush. It shows up in the Bible at various places. Now, think about this. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. This is a great picture right here. That's how much shade. You can see it right there. That's the shade. So, in other words, it's not this massive shade that you could get in for protection and coolness and to get out of the effect of the blazing sun, but it's just enough. It's a shade at your right hand. It's just enough shade. So these images are different than we would think of in terms of our kind of our prosperous society, or an area of wealth, that type of thing. These are all lessons that God is teaching his people, and of course us too, by extension. So that word shade, zel, actually means protection in other ways too, so that the sun will not harm you. And do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection, zel, is gone. But the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid. So, in other words, their protection, their shade is gone. So this is symbolic. God is saying, "Oh, put your enemies right out in the middle of the sun, and they will have no protection, so that you can conquer them, you can win them." So it's used in other ways too, in this sense right here. The broom bush was also the place that Elijah ran to after this great confrontation with the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And then he had this confrontation with Jezebel, and she really scared him. And he took off running. He ran all the way to the southern part of Israel eventually. He came to a broom bush, one of these, sat down under it and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and he fell asleep. Interesting. So he laid that little bush right there, that bush was going to ultimately save his life in a sense, because there God is going to kind of revive him. Another image here. "And it came to pass, as Aaron spake unto the whole congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked towards the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud." So the cloud is going to be protection for the Israelites during their wanderings in the desert. Now you might remember the other one would be the fire. The cloud would be by day to protect from the blazing sun, that protection. And the fire by night, the light to guide them. And the ancient Hebrews believed, in a sense, remember I told you they're very picture-oriented people, that the fire and cloud were the 2 feet of God. The fire, the cloud, as he walked ahead through the wilderness. You can kind of picture that. Now, this prophet right here, Jeremiah, he was really a kind of a shepherd prophet, because he had a lot of images in his writings about shepherds, and certainly the wilderness, because he lived outside of Jerusalem in a city called Anatoth, a small village at the time. He actually lived in the wilderness, so he knew the images firsthand. And he's going to talk about a cursed bush and a blessed tree. And at first glance, it seems kind of weird. What is that all about in Jeremiah 17? So the cursed bush is going to be called the Arara, and the blessed tree is going to be the acacia. And we're going to get into that right now, see what this means. Here's the reference. Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person will be like a bush in the wastelands. They will not see prosperity when it comes. They will dwell in the parched places of the desert in a salt land where no one lives. This is the bad side here. This person's in big trouble. But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. Let's look closely at what this is all about here. Okay, so first of all, the cursed part. Cursed is arur in Hebrew. The tree that he's referring to is the arara tree. It's kind of a Hebrew play on words. They do that. That happens a lot in the scriptures. Two words that sound alike. They're kind of like in parallel. Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person will be like a bush, arara, in the wastelands, is mentioned here. So what is this? Well, when you look at that bush, it looks pretty good. You know, it's green leaves, and it looks pretty nice. It's kind of like this whole idea of looking good, looking fine, where we don't need God, that we're fine. This the original lie from Satan, you can be like God. I am my own God. I'm a source of all truth. The arara tree, the cursed tree. Okay, so why this bush? Why is Jeremiah talking about this bush? Really specific reasons. All right, and this is fascinating. This bush looks really great, as I mentioned. Nice green leaves, especially in the picture of the desert now, because some of you might be thinking it didn't look that great, but we're talking about the desert where it's very, very harsh, not, not the Midwest. The fruit looks lush and watery. You can see it. It's kind of a yellowish green color. A traveler in that desert area could probably think maybe there's a source of water in there. It could be really, really juicy. But if you touch it, it explodes. You can see to the right what it looks like. It's toxic. It's so toxic and so poisonous, it literally could create a heart attack. It's that toxic. The Bedouins and the ancient people used this on their spear tips. So this beautiful looking fruit is anything but inside. The Bedouin referred to it as the Sodom apple, since it grows in a region around the Dead Sea, this very dry area near Sodom and Gomorrah, and actually kind of beyond in some of the other areas of the Judean wilderness. And there's a legend that during the time of Abraham, they bore beautiful fruit, these bushes. But when God destroyed these cities, he cursed this plant. That's a legend that they had back in that time period. So it looks great, but in reality, it's the opposite. So the lesson is pretty clear. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So when the outward appearance looks one way, and people want to say, hey, look at me, it's all good, but God looks at the heart. So what's the problem? Well, the life-giving water is only going to these leaves to make the bush look good. It is not going to the fruit, as you can see. It's a powdery, fluffy, cottony, poisonous mess inside. So the symbolism here is pretty clear. The idea of this water, which is kind of like living water, is representative of the Holy Spirit. If God is not penetrating, not just through the leaves, but to us to make fruit, then we are only that bush, trying to look good, but we don't really have any fruit. I think this is a really powerful image here. It's really fascinating. This part of the verse, but blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. Now, this is probably what a lot of us think of by that particular image. This is a picture of a river close to where I live. It's called the Jordan River. It's a really beautiful place. We might be thinking about these trees, but no, that's not it, because we're talking about the wilderness of Israel, the Midbar. Jeremiah has a really different image. What is it? Well, let's go into that valley, into this wilderness of Judea, this steep valley going down. And remember, It goes down very, very fast, and these deep canyons occasionally have water flowing down them during these seasonal rains. Okay. These valleys in Hebrew is sometimes called nakal, which means stream. So they also can be called streams when they fill with water. So here's a wadi, or nakal is another word. Wadi is actually more of an Arabic word. And you can see how it comes around. You can see these green objects. Those are trees. Okay. Now it's bone dry right now. So what's going on here? These are the trees Jeremiah is talking about. And you might say, what do you mean? Streams by living water. What's going on with that? Okay, another picture of a deeper wadi. You can see some trees right in the center of it here. Now, what about this river? What river? Well, there are no rivers other than the floods coming off the mountains. And they come down violently. They just pour down the hillsides. And it's actually the greatest danger in the wilderness in Israel. There's more people killed from this than anything every single year, especially tourists that don't understand how violent these things can be. And you can see as the water comes down and it gradually collects, the water is going to get higher and higher. It can be up to 50 to 70 feet deep, and it's coming down like a freight train, right on down. So this water, this would be the river, the type of river that he's talking about. It's coming down very, very fast. It's not a slow-moving river in any sense. It's a very dangerous river in many ways. And actually, it's very dangerous. So these trees, these acacia trees, looking closer at them, are not real tall, and they're not super impressive looking. They grow only about 20 feet tall, but their roots go 40 to 50 feet deep because they got to withstand this fast-moving water coming down the wadis. And yet they got to get deep enough to have enough water to somehow survive the rest of the year. Some of these have gone without water because not all these wadis have floods every year. Some of them have gone without water for many years. And they can go dormant, actually. So when the water doesn't seem to be there, it's so deep underground. And yet withstand these violent rivers of the wadis. So it's pretty incredible what these acacia trees can do and what they are like. This is a tree, the image that Jeremiah is talking about. Acacia trees still standing after a flood because the roots are so deep into the source of water. And it's also going to preserve it from falling over, having deep, deep, deep roots, much deeper than the tree itself. So the symbolism behind this is pretty clear. That God wants us to have deep roots so that we can survive these floods or these disasters that happen in life, because our roots are so deep into the life-giving waters that are beneath that we can withstand them. I took this picture a few years ago. I thought it was pretty fascinating, of an acacia tree like I've never seen. It's on a cliff. It's not exactly in the wadi here, but look at the root. See, I put an arrow to try to show you. It matches the rock, so it's a little hard to see, but it curls around from the tree. That tree is actually alive, and it goes down, and it keeps going down until eventually it gets to the bottom of the wadi, and then it goes down into the wadi. Now, this is the ultimate of a tree that sends out roots by the stream. That tree was not giving up. I'm going to create, my roots are going to go, even though I'm up here in this cliff, it's going to go all the way into the wadi and all the way down. I just thought that was fascinating. This tree is in the very southern part of Israel, near a city called Eilat. Now, let's look at a comparison of living water versus broken cisterns that is talked about in the scriptures here. Living water, which you've heard of before, and of course cisterns, but they're broken cisterns. Okay, my people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. So remember, living water is from God. It's directly from the hands of God, like a spring or a river, that type of thing. And a cistern is what a man makes, a person makes. And they just pool water that they've collected from rain or maybe some other source, and it just sits there. It's not great water because a lot of things can get in it. It's not nearly as clean. And man's cisterns, Jeremiah is talking about, these are broken cisterns that they cannot eventually even hold water because there's cracks in them. So even though they work fairly good, even though they aren't to be compared to living water, eventually they're in big trouble without that living water. So, this whole idea of broken cisterns is once again this whole idea of man saying, I can do this on my own. I can create my own life giving situation because I can rely on myself. Because, in a sense, I am God, I am the source of all truth. The same old lie that comes back all the time. It never will stop because it's one of the original lies of Satan. You can be as God. A couple more things. Now, we're just looking at images that don't relate to shepherding here, and I'm not even coming close to covering all of them that there are because there's so many in the wilderness in the Bible. But let's look at the idea of having feet of a deer. Now, the deer they're talking about, where I live in northern Michigan, we have white-tailed deer. That's not what the image is. It's called an ibex. This is an ibex right here. You can see these long horns. Here's another one. This is in Engedi. They have really good feet. They can just run across these rocks. You can see little ones to the left. Well, both sides, there's little ones and two large ones standing on top of the rocks. They literally can run across these rocks. They have amazing feet geared for it. David said, He makes my feet like the feet of the deer and sets me on high places. Well, David was here a lot. You can see where he got this image. He's looking at these ibex and he writes this. He makes my feet like that. So in other words, I want the feet like ibex that I can run across that mountain, across those rocks, and I'll be secure through God. God, give me those type of feet. So here's something interesting here. David didn't say remove the rocks. He said, give me feet like deer. That's what he prayed. I'm praying for feet like deer. Now, David's favorite place, I mentioned this before, is a place called Engedi. This arrow is pointing to it right here. There it is from above, looking down on it, Engedi, in the wilderness. It's a very beautiful place down in here. The springs come right out of the mountains above. You can see why he loved it here. And many of his images from the Psalms are from Engedi. More pictures of waterfalls. There's a whole series of waterfalls coming down. It's a beautiful place to hike. I've hiked it a few times and it's really pretty fascinating. It's pretty aggressive as you get higher up into it. Just beautiful area. In the middle of the wilderness, you have this. So this image, like a deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, O God. You can just picture David sitting here watching these deer drinking this water. And David saying, and of course, David went through plenty in his life. That's what I want too. Just literally looking at this image that God created these animals and thinking, that's what I want for my life too. This idea of He leads me beside still waters. Now, we're going to study it in detail in Psalms 23 episode because it's really significant. But this idea of still waters, just to mention it here, is Menucha means Sabbath-like rest. So in other words, this is a place of complete rest, of complete stillness, where I can get away from all the dangers and all the craziness of life and just sit there and breathe deep and just enjoy God's creation and rest. So I think, each of us have to have a place of still waters, clearly. That's something that we each need to do. And I think probably you do have a place where your still waters are. Then in conclusion, I want us to think about how is God like living water? This is a massive topic, but just kind of narrow it down to a simple idea here. From this verse, His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. So in other words, God's qualities of love, of mercy, and all these things are constant. They keep flowing. They keep moving like living water. And pictured on the right is a really cute little stream that is near my house. I walk this particular route every day. There's a little tiny bridge going over it. And I always stop and look at it. One day I videotaped it in the winter, as you can see. You can see the ice on the banks. Just kind of looking at it and focusing on it. I'm going to play this video. I think it's like 15 seconds. And as I do, you'll hear a little sound of the rushing water. And I'd like you to think about just this, how God is like living water. Well, thank you for watching today. This Lessons from the Wilderness. And my wish for you is shalom.